be seated. Almost feels like I should start with a disclaimer: do not try this at home after that previous reading. Don't drink poisons, don't pick up snakes. You know. It's a fascinating reading to have because it doesn't even belong in the Gospel of Mark and it's not part of the Bible. Okay? But it's the reading set for today because sometime in the 3rd, 4th or 5th century somebody decided the end of Mark needed a band-aid and they wrote that summary and stuck it on the end. But the earliest copies of Mark do not have those 2 or 3 paragraphs. It's a kind of summary of everything that happened, but it's not actually what Mark, it's not how Mark chose to end his gospel. And certainly, as we know from television, there are some strange churches in America where they do play with snakes and where the pastors die regularly of snake bite and poisoning. So it's an interesting tradition into which we are baptizing these 2 guys today. All right? Got to have our heads turned on as well as our hearts. So today, most people in Australia are thinking about ANZAC Day. There'll be a few people who've gone to Mass as well, and either today or tomorrow we'll be thinking about St. Mark, because as I mentioned earlier, those 2 observances overlap and fall on the same day. And at first glance, it doesn't seem like there's much in common between St. Mark, who I'll say more about in a moment, and ANZAC Day. And yet, when we think about it a little bit further, there are some interesting connections and about the way these 2 special commemorations intersect for us. For the most part, our religious calendar here in Australia comes, of course, from the Northern Hemisphere and Europe in particular. By the way, for the Greek Orthodox, today is Palm Sunday, just reminding us that the way we count time and the way we arrange our holy days is not set in concrete. It's cultural. It depends on how the calendar works in our part of the world. So because our calendar for Christmas and for Easter in particular tends to come from Northern Europe, our church year is out of sync with the place where we live. When we're celebrating new life at Easter, the trees are turning brown and the leaves are falling on the ground. It's the other way round, of course, up on the top side of the circle. And when we're celebrating the coming of the light in the darkness at Christmas, it's blazing summer and there's no shortage of daylight. So you can see how our liturgies have got out of sync with the places where we live, and in particular with the patterns and the dynamics of this ancient land. And instead of learning from the First Nations of this great Southland, we cling to rituals and seasons which come from the old country. And actually might have been comforting for the first settlers, but don't really work here. The festival for St. Mark started out that way as well. But as it happened, it was just a festival we inherited from the Church of England. But as it happened, that particular day, the Feast of St. Mark, was the day when the British forces, including ANZAC troops from Australia and New Zealand, landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. And as you may know, you may remember from some of those ANZAC Day talks we've heard over the years, April 25 was not the date which had been planned. It was meant to be April 23rd, but the weather was bad, so they delayed a couple more days before the landing. And instead of being undercover, it was a bright, moonlit morning. Really not what you want for something like the Gallipoli landing. So instead of happening on the Feast of St. George, it happened on the Feast of St. Mark, as things turned out. And in 1915, The 25th of April was a Sunday morning as well. But I don't imagine any of the soldiers rowing towards the beach, trying to duck the bullets, were thinking about either George or Mark. And I don't think that going to church was on their minds as well. But finally, we have a holiday that belongs to us here in Australia and in New Zealand. Because St Mark kind of got conscripted into the ANZACs by the accident of military planning and military events. So as we prepare to baptise Hamilton and Edison, let's think a little bit more about St Mark. Won't take long because we don't know very much about him. Okay? Lots of legends, but actually we don't know very much about Mark. But there's a few things we can probably be reasonably confident about. He was from Jerusalem. And we read about Jerusalem, of course, in that first reading. And the stole that I'm choosing to wear today is not only from Jerusalem, it features Palestinian stitching from the craft women of Jerusalem. His mother had a house inside Jerusalem. They had at least one paid servant, a young woman called Rhoda. And if you can afford one, you can probably afford more than one. So this was not just a peasant home, but a reasonably well-off family with at least one paid domestic helper. When the small group of Jesus people in Jerusalem, during the first few weeks after Easter, like we are now, 3 weeks after Easter, when they needed somewhere to meet, they met at Mark's mother's house. His father's never mentioned, which is interesting. There you go. So Mark's mother, who was reasonably well off, ran a safe house for the Jesus rebels who the authorities were trying to find. Okay? Those stories in John about Jesus appearing in a locked upstairs room and so on, it may well have been Mark's family home. That may be the place we're talking about. But certainly that's the house Peter goes to when he escapes from prison in Jerusalem. He goes around to Mary's house, the mother of Mark's house, it says, where the people were all gathered praying for Peter to get out of jail. He's knocking at the front door, and Rhoda comes to the door and says, "Oh my God, it's Peter," and shuts the door, leaves him outside in the street with the police looking for him, goes back in and says, "I think I saw Peter at the front door." Okay? So interesting, in shock and in some. This is the kind of setting the scene for Mark. And Mark himself seems to have been a young guy at the time. We don't know how young. Okay? We don't know if he was Edison's age, or Hamilton's age, or Theodore's age, or Netta's age, but he was a young person at the time. And he knew people like really well, he knew people like Barnabas, Peter, and Paul, which for a New Testament scholar, that's pretty cool. I'd like to have known. Well, if I knew those people, I'd be dead a long time ago. But he had some interesting friends. He almost certainly knew Mary, the mother of Jesus. So that would make him a good Roman Catholic, right? And he probably knew James, the brother of Jesus, who was kind of leader of the pack for the Jesus followers in Jerusalem. So Mark grows up in what we could almost call the very first Christian family. Okay? Jesus didn't. Jesus was not only not an Anglican, he wasn't a Christian. Okay? He was a Jewish person, and he grew up in a faithful, practicing Jewish home in Nazareth. So in Mark's family, in Mark's parents' house, we might have the very first Christian family. That's not in the written text, I just thought of it. But anyway, there you go. So Mark is a really interesting character. And there's something else about Mark. he had two names, and I'm not talking about a nickname. Okay, he had two names. Sometimes he's called John, also known as Mark, and sometimes he's just called Mark. Okay? John and Mark. We call him Mark because we're not Jewish, and Mark was his name in the Greco-Roman world, in the world of the Roman Empire, where everybody at the eastern end of the empire spoke Greek. Marcus was a name that would have been familiar. And it was a famous name, including people like Mark Antony. So when he's mixing with the shopkeepers and the merchants and the soldiers in the streets of Jerusalem, when he's going to the government officials, and when he's interacting with others that are not Jewish, he says, "My name is Mark." And it was. But inside his own culture and inside his own family circle, he was known as John. Actually, not John, but Johannan, from which we get John. Okay? And that's an ancient Jewish name. And again, it's a famous Jewish name because there were a couple of Jewish kings about 100 years before whose first name was Johannan. We call them John Hyrcanus, the first and the second. Now that's, I think, worth knowing about, because the reason Mark had two names is that he lived in two worlds. He lived in the world of the past, the Jewish world in which his family was shaped, and he also lived in the Roman world, the world of the future. So Mark was a young man, possibly just a teenager, at the very moment in time when everything was in the process of changing. So were the young men who landed on Gallipoli on this day in 2015. They didn't know it. Well, they're all young men. What they didn't realise was that the world was changing. The way the world had been organised up until the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in 2014 was all but gone and will never come back. So the young men who landed at Gallipoli shared something else in common with Mark. And indeed, we still have not put all the pieces back together in the Middle East since that war. Mark didn't realise it at the time, but everything in the ancient world that he knew was also about to change. Just a few weeks earlier, we don't know the exact number of weeks we're talking about, but just a few weeks earlier, Jesus had been executed by the Roman Empire. In less than 300 years' time from then, the Emperor of Rome would himself be a follower of Jesus. And instead of having to meet secretly in someone's house, like the Jerusalem Jesus people did at Mark's mother's house, they'd be lining up, not because of COVID, they'd be lining up to get into the basilica, into the town hall, because there were so many people wanting to say, look at me, I'm a Christian too. Okay? Total change from take that guy out, get rid of him, to, well, hang on, now the emperor's a Christian, perhaps we better start going to church. So, Hamilton and Edison, you are alive in a time of great change. Everything is changing around us. I might have had storybooks to play with in church, Edison, but I didn't have an iPad. But I get one now, okay? So everything is changing in the world that we live in. And we don't know what the future is going to look like, except it's going to look a lot more like that than this, okay? That's yesterday's information technology. That's tomorrow's information technology. So in that sense, you two guys have quite a lot in common with John Mark. Mark didn't have all the answers, and we actually know he didn't always get things right. In fact, he messed up so badly one time that Paul refused to speak to him for several years. Would have nothing to do with him. I'm not taking him with me again. Okay? But his cousin Barnabas did. Mark had the courage to live as a person of faith in a world that was changing. He didn't need all the answers. He just needed to know that when Jesus talked about the kingdom of God, our Father who art in heaven, remember? Your kingdom come, your will be done, that was the best way for him to live his life. So when you're baptised in a couple of minutes, that's what you're doing as well. You're not coming over here to pretend that you passed the special Cathedral exam to be allowed to be baptised, even though you've got the best Christian studies teacher in the whole of CBAS. Okay? Correct? What you're saying is, I don't have all the answers, but I'm saying yes to the opportunity to stand next to Jesus while everything else around me changes. And the rest of us will be standing there beside you and beside Jesus as well. And guess what? We don't have all the answers either. Okay? But we all share the hunch that by standing alongside Jesus, we will be in the right place and on the right side of history. And we have a special word for that hunch: faith. So let's come to the font, guys, and let's say yes to Jesus and yes to God. Come on across.